There's a diverse set of terminology that's involved when we're thinking about automated testing. The most important unit that we often think about in this domain is the individual test case. So a test case just evaluates a single explicit behavior within your program. Now, we don't just execute a single test case. Usually we execute sets of test cases, and these are called test suites. So suites are just a high-level construct that enable us to group sets of related test cases together. Now, the code that each individual test case is actually evaluating is called the code under test, or CUT. Although sometimes you'll see this referred to as the system under test, or SUT. So the code under test and system under test represent the code that an individual test case or set of test cases encapsulated in a test suite are evaluating. At a high level, there are two main mechanisms we can use to write test cases. So the first is called white box testing. So in white box testing, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the code under test and actually look at its internals to see how it's working. And by looking at the code, we can determine what kind of test cases we want to create. The other high-level mechanism for writing tests is called black box. And in black box testing, what we're going to do instead is we're going to look at the specification for the code under test and design our test cases from that. So we won't actually look under the covers at all. In fact, we're explicitly forbidden from looking under the covers. Now, when we're designing either white box or black box test cases, we want these test cases to be effective. That is, we want them to be sensitive to failures in the code under test. Because if we write a test case that can never ever fail or would never detect a failure in the code under test, it really has no value. So keeping effectiveness in mind is always important when we're designing tests, regardless of whether they're white box tests or black box tests.